Welcome to our deep dive into the terms left and right. We're going to unpack what they really mean and how they came to be such loaded terms in our political landscape. You've given us some great source material to work with, and it's clear you're ready to go beyond the usual sound bites.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
It's fascinating how these terms originated from something as simple as seating arrangements during the French Revolution. Radicals on the left, conservatives on the right. Who knew where people parked themselves could become shorthand for such complex ideologies?
Right. And it gets even more interesting when we consider how psychology plays into all of this. One of your sources uses this metaphor of a running race to explore political leanings, and it really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's a great way to visualize it. Imagine a race where left implies a focus on everyone finishing together. There's an emphasis on helping the slower runners, a sense of collective achievement. On the right, it's more about individual speed and performance. Each runner is responsible for their own success.
Okay, so how does this running race metaphor actually play out in the real world?
Well, think about social programs. Someone on the left might see universal health care, for instance, as a way to ensure everyone in the race has the resources they need to stay healthy and keep running. It's about leveling the playing field.
Whereas someone on the right might view it as an interference with individual choice and responsibility. They might argue that individuals should be free to choose their own healthcare plans and shouldn't be obligated to help those who haven't taken care of themselves.
Exactly. And this ties into the core values often associated with left and right. Your sources highlighted that the left tends to prioritize social equality, reducing inequality through things like social programs and public services, government intervention in the economy to ensure fairness and cultural progressiveness, advocating for things like gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and racial justice.
And the right, on the other hand, often emphasizes values like economic freedom, minimal government interference in the markets, free markets, and low taxes, individual responsibility, and traditional values when it comes to culture.
It's important to remember that this is a spectrum, of course. Very few people perfectly embody every single aspect of either left or right. Your sources actually point out that people can hold a mix of views. For example, you can be socially progressive but economically conservative.
So you might be passionate about LGBTQ plus rights, but also believe in the power of free markets.
Exactly. Or you could be someone who values traditional family structures but also supports social welfare programs for those in need. These categories are starting points, not ending points.
Now, one of your sources brought up a really intriguing study about solidarity and what motivates it. It suggests that people are more likely to support collective action if they believe they might need help themselves in the future.
It's like, if I'm not sure if I'll be the front runner or someone who needs assistance to finish the race, I'm more likely to support a system that provides that assistance.
So, uncertainty about our own future outcomes can actually drive us towards more collectivist views.
That's what the research suggests. And this can help us understand why certain demographics might lean towards one side or the other. For example, your sources mention that people with higher socioeconomic status often lean, right? One theory is that they're less likely to need those social safety nets and therefore less inclined to support them. They're confident in their ability to win the race, so to speak.
But then your sources also bring up a counterpoint that some high SES individuals do support left leaning policies, not necessarily for their own direct benefit, but because they see the value in a more stable and prosperous society as a whole.
They understand that if everyone has a fair shot, the entire race, the entire society benefits in the long run. It's not just about individual winners, but about the overall health and strength of the pack.
That's where the concept of solidarity gets really interesting. Your sources suggest that there's an evolutionary challenge to solidarity, especially for those who are ahead. It's easier to prioritize helping others when you're not worried about your own survival rate.
Absolutely. If you're struggling to even finish the race yourself, extending a hand to someone else can feel incredibly risky. And this ties into some of the psychological underpinnings of political leanings that your sources explored.
Okay, let's dive into those psychological factors. What kind of things are we talking about?
Well, one thing your sources highlighted is that people who are more risk-averse tend to gravitate towards policies that offer security and stability. They might prefer a system where there are more rules and regulations, even if it means some limitations on individual freedom.
Because those rules provide a sense of predictability and safety. It's like having a clearer course marked out for the race, even if it means everyone has to run at a certain pace.
Exactly. Whereas individuals with a higher tolerance for risk might embrace more individualistic free market principles. They're comfortable with the ups and downs of a less regulated environment, even if it means there's less of a safety net. They're okay with navigating a more unpredictable course, even if some runners might stumble along the way.
So it's not just about economics or social issues, it's about how comfortable we are with uncertainty and how much control we feel we need over our own outcomes.
That's right. And these psychological tendencies can often be seen in how different cultures approach governance and social structures. You wanted to compare Europe and the U.S. in this context, and your sources offer some really interesting insights.
Yeah, I've always been curious about why Europe seems to lean more socialist while the US is more individualistic.
Well, your sources point to a few key factors. One is historical context. Europe has a long history of social welfare states and labor movements, which have shaped their collective values. The U.S., on the other hand, has a founding narrative rooted in individual liberty and self-reliance.
So their starting points, their origin stories are very different.
Precisely. And those differences are reflected in their cultural values.
Yeah.
Europe's emphasis on collective responsibility and solidarity versus the U.S. focus on individual freedom and entrepreneurship.
It's almost like two different approaches to the same race. Europe is focused on ensuring everyone finishes together, while the US is more about celebrating the individual winners.
That's a great way to put it. And of course, their economic structures have evolved to reflect these values.
Mm.
Europe has higher taxes and more regulated markets, which lead to a more even distribution of wealth. The U.S., with its lower taxes and less regulation, has a much wider gap between the richest and the poorest. It's a different set of rules for the race.
Now, here's where things get really fascinating. Your sources cite some research on happiness and how it relates to redistribution of wealth. Apparently, countries with stronger social safety nets and less inequality tend to have higher levels of happiness overall.
It's an intriguing finding.
Yeah.
The research suggests that this is because those in lower socioeconomic groups experience less poverty and insecurity, which raises the average happiness level.
So even if those at the top aren't significantly happier, the overall well-being of the society is boosted by making sure everyone has their basic needs met.
Exactly. And your sources point out that exceeding a certain income level doesn't actually correlate with increased happiness. So redistributing resources could be a way to boost overall happiness without significantly impacting the well-being of the wealthiest, an efficient way to maximize societal happiness.
It's like making sure everyone in the race has enough water and sustenance to keep going, even if some runners are naturally faster than others.
Now, you specifically asked about how immigration fits into this picture, and it's a complex issue with a lot of emotional weight. Your sources use the running race metaphor to illustrate this challenge. Imagine runners from other races who are lagging behind suddenly joining your race. Does solidarity extend to helping them, even if it means potentially slowing down your own progress?
It's a tough question. There's that sense of wanting to help, but also a concern for resources and the potential impact on those who are already running, especially if the reasons those new runners are lagging behind are complex and not easily addressed.
Right? And this can be particularly challenging for those who lean, right, who prioritize individual responsibility and the idea of a level playing field. They might ask, why should runners who didn't train properly or who started the race later be given the same advantages as those who've been following the rules?
It almost feels like two different sets of rules colliding, and that can create a lot of tension and debate.
And your sources point out that cultural and ideological differences between immigrant groups and the host society can further complicate feelings of solidarity. It's like these new runners not only have different levels of training, but are also running a different kind of race altogether.
It highlights that deep-seated evolutionary tendency to prioritize and protect one's own group, even if it comes at the expense of others. It's easier to feel solidarity with those who are similar to us, who share our values and experiences.
And this brings us to another fascinating concept from your sources, the Dybig phenomenon.
Ah, yes, Doug. I admit this one really intrigued me. It's like doing good, but with a layer of cynicism or suspicion.
Exactly. Your sources point out that some people view these acts of doing good with distrust, questioning the motives behind them.
Why would someone be suspicious of someone else's good deeds? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, one theory is that it's rooted in the perception of hypocrisy. People suspect that these good deeds are done more for social approval or status than out of genuine altruism. They see it as a performance rather than authentic kindness.
So it's like those runners who are suddenly very vocal about helping others, but maybe it's more about looking good than actually caring about those who are struggling.
That's one way to look at it. And cultural and ideological differences can also play a role here. If you see someone from a different team, so to speak, doing something that seems good according to their values, you might question whether their definition of good aligns with your own.
So even acts of kindness can become politicized and subject to interpretation.
Absolutely. And your sources suggest that another factor at play here is something called in-group bias. It's a psychological phenomenon where we naturally favor our own group and are more wary of those outside our circle. So we might be more critical of good deeds done by those who we perceive as being different from us.
It's like those runners who are quick to help their own teammates but hesitate to extend a hand to those from competing teams.
Exactly. And this can create a dynamic where even seemingly positive actions are viewed through a lens of suspicion and division. It shows how deeply ingrained these political leanings can be and how they can shape our perceptions even in seemingly non-political situations.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the origins of left and right to the psychological factors that shape these labels, and even touched on some real-world examples like social programs and immigration. It's clear that these terms are much more than just simple opposites. They represent a whole web of values, beliefs, and even evolutionary pressures. But let's take a quick pause here and dive into some even more specific case studies in part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork, but now I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty. What are some real-world scenarios where these different perspectives on left and right really clash?
Well, one that your sources hit on pretty hard is healthcare. It's a perfect example of how the running race metaphor translates into actual policy debates.
Okay, let's break that down. Healthcare is always a hot topic, so I'm curious how this plays out.
Your sources highlight that those who lean left often see healthcare as a fundamental right, something everyone should have access to regardless of their income or employment status. It's like making sure every runner has access to the same quality medical tent regardless of their position in the race. So it's about creating a level playing field in terms of health and well-being, even if some runners might need more support than others to stay in the game.
Precisely. And from this perspective, it's seen as a collective responsibility. Everyone contributes to ensure that no one is left behind due to illness or injury. It's about ensuring the overall health of the pack, not just the individual runners.
But on the right, there's a different perspective, right?
Yes, a more right-leaning perspective might emphasize personal responsibility for health choices and financial planning.
Mm.
There's a belief that individuals should have more control over their own healthcare decisions and costs, and that government involvement should be minimized.
So it's more like each runner is responsible for their own training regimen and any medical care they might need. If they haven't prepared adequately, they might face consequences on the race course.
Exactly. And this perspective often aligns with the values of economic freedom and limited government intervention that we discussed earlier. There's a concern that excessive government involvement in healthcare could stifle innovation and lead to inefficiencies.
So it's a fundamental disagreement about the role of the government and the balance between individual responsibility and collective support. And this same tension seems to play out in other policy areas as well, like environmental policy, which your sources also delve into.
Absolutely. Environmental policy is another arena where left and right perspectives often diverge. Your sources point out that those on the left tend to favor stricter regulations and investments in renewable energy, even if it means higher costs in the short term. They see it as an investment in the long-term health of the planet, like ensuring the race course itself remains sustainable for future generations.
They're thinking about the bigger picture, about the impact our actions have on the environment that all runners share.
Right. And they might argue that the potential consequences of inaction on issues like climate change are far greater than any economic burdens those regulations might impose.
Hmm.
It's about preventing a catastrophic event that could disrupt the entire race, so to speak.
But on the right, there might be a different set of priorities.
Yes. A more right-leaning perspective might emphasize economic growth and affordability, arguing that excessive regulations can stifle innovation and job creation. They might be concerned that focusing too much on environmental protection could slow down the pace of the race, so to speak, and hinder economic progress.
So it becomes a balancing act between protecting the environment and ensuring economic competitiveness. It's like weighing the benefits of a well-maintained race course against the need for runners to reach their full potential.
Exactly. And it's a complex issue with no easy answers. But understanding these different perspectives can help us have more productive conversations about how to address environmental challenges.
Now, your sources also brought up this fascinating point about risk aversion and how it plays into political leanings. I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, your sources suggest that people who are more comfortable with risk, those who are okay with a bit of uncertainty, might be more drawn to individualistic free market principles. They see economic uncertainty as an opportunity for innovation and entrepreneurialism. They're the runners who are comfortable taking a riskier path, even if it means there's a chance of stumbling or falling behind.
They thrive on the challenge, the potential for a big payoff, even if it comes with greater risk.
Exactly. But those who are more risk-averse might prefer policies that offer greater security and stability, even if it means some limitations on individual freedom or economic growth. They're the runners who prefer a well-marked, predictable course, even if it means everyone has to run at a more controlled pace.
So it's like choosing between a more adventurous off-road race versus a traditional track race where the path is clearly defined. And our tolerance for risk might influence which race we'd prefer to run.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights how psychological factors beyond just economic or social considerations can shape our political preferences. It's not just about logic and reason, but about our deeper emotional responses to uncertainty and risk.
And this brings us back to the idea that these left and right labels aren't just about policies or positions on specific issues, but about deeper psychological tendencies and worldviews.
Absolutely. And understanding those underlying motivations can help us have more productive conversations about politics, even when we disagree. It's not just about left versus right, but about understanding the values, fears, and aspirations that drive those political beliefs.
Now, one final piece from your sources that I want to touch on is the concept of the limits of solidarity. We talked about this briefly in the context of immigration, but it seems to be a theme that runs through a lot of these discussions.
It's a crucial point. Your sources suggest that even the most empathetic individuals can experience compassion fatigue, particularly when faced with seemingly endless needs, or when their efforts feel like they're making little difference. It's like a runner who's constantly extending a hand to others, but eventually they start to feel exhausted and wonder if they can keep going at that pace.
There's a sense of overwhelm that can set in, and it can lead to questioning the sustainability of certain social programs or policies.
Exactly. And it can be especially challenging when there are cultural or ideological differences between those in need and those providing support. It's like runners from different teams trying to help each other. But there's a lack of understanding or trust that makes it difficult to truly connect and offer meaningful assistance.
We see this play out in debates about immigration welfare programs and even foreign aid.
Right. And your sources argue that it's not about a lack of compassion, but rather a recognition of the complexities involved in balancing individual responsibility, societal obligations, and the limits of available resources. It's about recognizing that even the most well-intentioned runner can only carry so much weight before they risk jeopardizing their own progress in the race.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one to consider as we navigate these complex societal challenges. This deep dive has been so insightful, helping me understand that left and right are more than just labels. They represent a whole constellation of values, experiences, and even evolutionary pressures.
And the key takeaway is that understanding these deeper motivations is crucial for having more nuanced and productive conversations about politics.
Well said. Let's take a moment to reflect on all we've discussed and then wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts and a challenge for you, our listener. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of left and right. We've explored the origins of these terms, the values and psychological tendencies they represent, and even how they play out in real-world scenarios like healthcare and environmental policy. We've seen that the running race metaphor can be a powerful tool for understanding these different perspectives.
Absolutely.
It highlights the tension between individual achievement and collective responsibility,
Right.
and how our own experiences and tolerance for risk can shape our political leanings.
Yeah.
But as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that these labels are just starting points,
Yeah.
not ending points.
They're tools for understanding different viewpoints, not boxes to trap ourselves or others in.
Throughout this conversation, we've emphasized the importance of nuance.
Yeah.
The fact that people rarely fit neatly into one category.
Right.
And that's a good thing.
That is it.
It means there's room for dialogue, for understanding,
Absolutely.
and for finding common ground even across political divides.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You know, one of the things that your sources, I think, really kind of bring to light is that a lot of times we get so caught up in the labels themselves, and we forget that there are real people with real experiences and real values behind those labels.
And that's what this deep dive has really been all about.
Yeah.
You know, going beyond those surface level classifications
the
and
one.
really trying to understand the deeper motivations
Yes.
that shape our political beliefs. So here's the challenge we're leaving you with, our listener.
Okay.
Think about the running race metaphor.
Right.
Where do you see yourself on that track? What values and experiences shape your own pace and direction?
And I would even add to that, you know, don't be afraid to Examine those values and
Yeah.
experiences. Where do they come from?
Oh, that's a great point.
Are they serving you well?
Yeah.
Are they helping you to connect with others? Or are they creating barriers?
And are they maybe leading you to make assumptions about people who you perceive as being on a different part of that track?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the more we can be honest with ourselves about our own values and experiences, the more we can start to bridge those divides and have those really productive conversations that we've been talking about.
It's so easy to get caught up in the us versus them mentality.
Right.
But the reality is we're all running this race together.
We are.
And we all have a stake in the outcome.
Absolutely. And I would even say that, the finish line isn't really the point. It's the journey.
It's about how we treat each other along the way.
Exactly. And how we support each
And
other.
how we learn from each other.
Absolutely.
So as we reach the finish line of this deep dive,
Uh-huh.
we want to leave you with this final thought.
Right.
The labels, left and right, can be useful tools, but they should never define us
They should never limit us.
or limit our ability to connect with others.
Absolutely.
Keep questioning, keep learning,
Keep running.
and keep diving deep. That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.